before going into that conversation with the patient, it's important to be well prepared, and as prepared as you can be, really. And I guess part of that is assembling all the medical information that is available, including what's gone on before, what treatments have been given, how the patient has responded to those treatments or not responded. Thinking about how, or finding out, if possible, what conversations have been held with them and their family, and really some of their reactions that have occurred along the way. I guess both emotional reactions and physical reactions to the treatments, of course, but getting a good sense of what's gone on before and understanding what may well be available or what's been offered as well.
Particularly if the patient's someone that's not already known to you, and even if they are someone that you've known previously, it's good just to make sure that you know exactly where they're up to, and to sort of let them do some of the talking, even though you walk into the room with your prerogative or what you want to achieve. I think it's important to see where the patient's up to, make sure that they've got a good understanding of their illness, and in fact in that talking they often give you a number of cues about where they're up to, and certainly I found that sometimes they even bring up some conversation about what they might want in the future. It certainly makes it a lot easier if you let them do the talking. And sometimes the cues come up, you don't have to do a lot. Just saying to them that this is an opportunity for us to make sure that we're both up to speed and that we both have all the information. Often there are lots of different doctors involved, and as Jen said, I would have done a lot of the preparation and tried to have an understanding myself. But it's really helpful for the patient, I think, to have that opportunity, and most of them will take it if you ask them sort of how they're going and what their understanding of their illness is. So even just saying that, you know, what is your understanding of your illness or where we're up to.
And I think that there is real opportunities in those first sort of opening conversations. Importantly, and perhaps I should have mentioned before, it's good to have family. If the patient wants family there, it's good to have them as part of it, so that it's not something that's happening in isolation, it's happening as part of the patient's life and their community. And I think that sometimes when you start these conversations, sometimes patients will ask you a question that seems like an important question and you don't want to ignore it, but you're not quite ready to answer it yet. So maybe very early on the patient may even say, well, you know, how long have I got to live, or something that really sort of is a big question and one not to be ignored. But it's almost sort of too early because you don't know what they know necessarily. So it's useful to have some thought or some techniques or some language around how you might manage that. And something that I've found useful, if someone asks something like that, how long have I got to live, and you've really only just gone into the consultation, I will often say something like, well, that's a really important question and one that I'd like to answer, but in order to answer it, you know, well for you and as well as I can, there's probably a little bit that I need to find out first. And you know, one of those things is, can you tell me what you understand? I've heard what the doctors have said about what's going on, but what do you understand about what's been going on from your perspective? And it's not uncommon that perhaps people have been told, and their previous treating doctor or whoever it might be has said, you know, we've sat down with this person and told them all and they know exactly what's going on. But in fact the person just may not have heard that, or you know, they heard the first sentence and then completely shut down, so they may not really know what's going on. And until, as Jenny said, until everyone's on the same sort of level of understanding, then it's hard to move forward.
This is the thing about not sort of marching in with your intention sort of straight up. I mean, it may well be your intention to have some of these conversations and maybe to think about what somebody wants in the future, but I think it's important to sort of start at the beginning, so to make sure that you're prepared, as we've said, but also to make sure that we're all up to date, because in fact then the conversations can fall out quite naturally without having to be too forced. Whereas if someone doesn't have all the information on board, I think we've all seen someone walk into a room and sort of want to talk about, you know, what they want at the end of their life, and someone's really not even aware that they're really at the end of their life. That's clearly not going to work out well for anybody. So some of this groundwork and taking the time to be prepared and taking the time to listen to what's going on, and maybe to even provide information if necessary, certainly makes the path a lot smoother. That idea of it being an ongoing conversation is certainly true, and I think ideally we would all agree that these conversations should happen amongst doctors and patients, or healthcare professionals and patients who know each other well. I mean, ideally it would be in an outpatient situation, not in a sort of a crisis, and ideally it would be an ongoing discussion, as you say, where you're getting to really understand someone's values and ideas and building on conversation and having them go away and think about it, rather than sort of a wham-bam sort of 10-minute let's do this thing.
An important component of thinking about the way forward and planning treatment with someone is to understand what's important for them. And so it's part of this conversation therefore needs to be how we get or understand what someone's values are, what their goals are. And I think before we get into that, we probably almost need permission from the patient to be able to discuss these sorts of things. And some of that is actually just asking. And patients and families will have different ways in which they come at these sorts of things, and different community groups or different cultural groups will have different ways in which decisions are made within that group. And so we need to be mindful and sensitive to that too. So I think therefore a question around, this is where we're up to. We've all agreed that you understand where we're up to, and we've given you some information about what we understand where things are up to. And I think at that point is a useful time to say, would you like to discuss what might happen in the future? And if so, what would you like, how would your medical care proceed in that circumstance? What are the things that's important to this person, and therefore their medical care can reflect those values? I ask someone. So I say, look, you've been through a very rough time recently. At these sorts of times, people often reflect on, what are the important things in life? And for you, at the moment, what are the things that you're really valuing in life? And what do you see as being the things that are important to you moving forward? And sometimes they're things that surprise you, which is the delight about this job. Sometimes it might be, that I get great joy when my granddaughter visits every day, and she puts a smile on my face. And sometimes it might be, I just want to be at home so I can look after my dog. And sometimes they're sort of quite humbling things. So people, just want to stay in their own home for as long as they can, or such. So, they're not necessarily grandiose things that people are chasing.
I remember seeing a fellow who'd had had nasty diabetes amongst his multiple medical problems, and had actually become unconscious and come into ED unconscious, and reflecting about that incident, which was sort of what we'd done in our preparatory talk, sort of led into the discussion, well, at that time you weren't able to communicate what you would want, or make decisions about your care. Have you spoken to someone in your family, or have you nominated someone that you would want to make some of these healthcare decisions for you, or have you thought about what you would like? Because that's certainly something that we can do in the doctor-patient relationship, is sort of get this understanding of what would be important to you. So I think sometimes in the setting of chronic illness, some of these sort of previous events or reflecting on recent events can be a nice way in, without again being too sort of explicit or forcing something.
I would agree with that. I think that's a really useful technique to, particularly if someone is seemingly reticent to engage in these discussions. I think, following an event, maybe it was an event where they had an exacerbation of their airways disease, or an episode of diabetes when they became unconscious. Following an event, in the quiet of day in the outpatients, as opposed to in the acute setting where everything's pressured, to sit down and say, sounds like you had a pretty rough time. Can you tell me what it was like to have that assisted ventilation? What did it feel like? How was it for you? Do you understand what was going on? In the event that that you were to get sick again, have you thought about what that would mean and you know, what we should be thinking about in those circumstances? So some people, in fact not uncommonly, there's a man the other week who said to me, oh, I don't want to go through that again. And I'm not sure that his doctors really knew that. You know, he was, and obviously that needed a bit of unpacking and thinking about it. It shouldn't be just accepted at face value, but it needs to be acknowledged, and that's an important piece of information that often just goes sort of undercover if it's not actually sort of looked for.
So as a health professional, when I'm having these conversations or find out a piece of information like we've been talking about, that someone wouldn't want to go through a particular treatment again, or that their main goal in life is to be able to remain in their own home, I think it's good at the time to sort of flesh out what that means. And so in the context of this conversation to say, well, perhaps if I'm understanding you correctly, if a particular treatment was needed and that perhaps meant that it was very unlikely that you'd be able to get home on your own again, it sounds as though perhaps you're saying that you wouldn't want to pursue that treatment. So just sort of make sure that I've understood and to clarify that I've understood. But often those little bits of information, that sort of value, can actually help you plan their care really well without sort of anyone having to get sort of too explicit.
Having made some or reached some understanding of how medical care would best match a person's values, or if someone has said that there's a particular thing that they don't want or do want, or you know, if it gets to that sort of level of explicitness, and that's, I guess, likely in the setting of a patient who's actually been through some of those treatments before, and then you can talk quite specifically about some of those treatments. I think a really critical thing is to engage with that person's wider community, be that their family, because in the event that that person is not well and comes in with an acute event, and perhaps they have been quite explicit about what they think would be appropriate care for themselves and what they would prefer not to have, unless the family is well aware and understanding of those wishes, then it becomes a very difficult sort of situation in the acute event. So I think that an important piece of work that needs to accompany these sort of conversations is engaging with that person's key people, and with their permission, but that this is a broader conversation than just with the patient.
So documentation's important in the medical record. I think having these conversations is obviously part of what we do, and part of what people should be doing in outpatient clinics with patients with chronic life-limiting illnesses. And I think, you know, in addition to the documentation, it's encouraging patients to have these conversations with their families. I think we need to have these conversations with their broader sort of family, friends, caring group. But encouraging patients to have these conversations gives them a little bit of a sense of control over making sure that something that was unpleasant didn't happen, or that their wishes are respected. And of course there is the process of nominating a decision maker. Again, something to encourage patients to do. It certainly makes it less fraught in situations where there's some disagreement about who the person should be.
And you touched on something there, Jenny, which I think is important to highlight. Many of us in healthcare shy away from these conversations because they're difficult and we're worried that we're going to upset people. It takes time and everyone will feel hopeless as a result of it. But my experience is not necessarily that that's the case. I think that if done sensitively and done at the patient's pace and checking in and asking permission throughout the process, I think that these conversations can actually really enhance quality of life for people, because it enables them to have some sense of controlling the decisions around their care, and through that sort of certainty seems to, for many people, open up a whole lot of freedoms that they didn't really have access to before. So I think that it's an important component of care, and it's an important component of enhancing quality of life for people.
The people that I'm thinking of as we're having this conversation were often really grateful to be able to talk about what they wanted and what had worked well in their medical past and what hadn't worked well. I think that they really appreciated the opportunity to talk and then the opportunity to do something about it.
We had an interesting situation the other day with an elderly man who had had a number of treatments for cancer, and there was questions about, and he'd progressed more recently through the most recent treatment, and there was questions about another treatment and whether another, and he was sort of seemingly agitating for another line of chemotherapy, and as was his family. There was potentially another line of chemotherapy that could have been available, but the question was whether that was going to be the wisest thing to do. And there was quite a lot of hesitation amongst the medical staff around approaching this, because they had a sense that perhaps it wasn't a wise thing to do, but this man seemed to be wanting it. Anyway, we sat down with him and his family and talked about possibility, talked about where things were up to and what things might look like without treatment, what things might look like with treatment. And as within that conversation was what was important to him. And he chose very clearly to not have treatment, which was sort of the recommended course, but very clearly to not have treatment. And then actually what was interesting is that his agitation and his sort of anxiety and heightened vigilance and a bit aggressiveness on the ward just sort of settled, and he made some decisions, went home, said I want to be at home. His family all came together, and the plan was for him to be looked after at home for his end of life care. Through good decision making and matching the medical care according to his values, there was all this sort of possibility realised for this man, which otherwise wouldn't have been if he'd gone down a sort of an ongoing treatment, sort of linked and tied to hospitals and tests and things. So I do think that there is in and of itself, there's a great deal of therapeutic value in having these conversations.
And that idea of hope's interesting. I think it's one that we think about a lot, and I think that having the information and then coming up with realistic goals, I think is a much better situation than people sort of avoiding a subject and sort of jollying someone through something that is all quite unrealistic. That we all, I think we often come into situations where there's an acknowledgement that what the patient's hoping for is not realistic, whereas often with the right information and with this sort of sense of control about the decision making, I think there can certainly be lots of hope. I don't see these people that we've had these conversations with as being less hopeful. In fact, I think they're often more settled and able to make realistic plans.
And they're hoping for things that are achievable, that won't fail them, as opposed to hoping for something that's going to inevitably let them down. And I think that's sort of coming back to that notion of quality of life, which is a sort of a trotted out phrase, but I think that that's where that's realised, in that actually people are achieving and having a potentially creative part to this final phase of their life, as opposed to something that they're always striving for that they can never reach.
One of the most important messages is that this is important work, and it doesn't burst their bubble. It's not a terrible thing to do, and in fact patients appreciate the conversation.